My name is Matt Segall. I'm a process philosopher and transdisciplinary researcher. I teach process philosophy as an associate professor at the California Institute of Integral Studies in a department called Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness. And I'm excited to talk to you today about Michael Levin's Platonic research program for biology. I want to try to accomplish three things. First, I'll briefly introduce Michael Levin's program and why I think it's so significant. Second, I want to unfold a process-relational Whiteheadian way of understanding what his lab is uncovering. That's Alfred North Whitehead's process philosophy. Um, this approach will, I hope, honor a structured realm of possibilities, what he calls the realm of eternal objects, without turning those possibilities or patterns into some kind of disembodied puppet masters. Third, I'll suggest how this reframing reshapes our broader metaphysical picture of the relationship between matter and form, law and novelty, physics and biology, and I might even need to make a few theological points. By the way, this is my cat Philo. He's decided to join me for this. So the mystery of biological form has led some biologists, most prominently Michael Levin, back to Plato's theory of ideas. Levin's lab has produced a series of remarkable results on bioelectric patterning in morphogenesis. The headline here is simple enough. Basically, as I understand it, if you tinker with the bioelectric fields that guide embryological development, you can profoundly alter the resulting anatomy of the organisms in question, inducing, for example, most shockingly, eyes on the tail of a tadpole, or reorganizing tissue fragments into novel motile collectives. So Levin is driven primarily by these surprising empirical findings. He argues that the behavior of cells, tissues, whole organisms, multicellular organisms is often best explained by reference to modes of causality that are not traceable to genetic histories or local molecular components. DNA is necessary, of course, but it's not sufficient. This is a major shift in biological thinking. The genome does not specify uh, coordinate by coordinate where every cell must end up in uh, a metazoan organism. Instead, Levin, as I understand it, is suggesting that cells participate in a larger space of morphogenetic possibility, a kind of Platonic morphospace, as he has taken to calling it. So he's now framing his work as a Platonic research program and claiming that both biological form and organismic agency ingress from a realm beyond physical spacetime, with external bodies, physical bodies functioning as what he calls thin user interfaces. He uses this term ingress, which he borrows from Whitehead. He's quick to add, though, that he's not necessarily affirming or denying Plato's full philosophy. Rather, he's trying to think uh, this idea of form and link his hypothesis to a contemporary position in the philosophy of mathematics. So this is not really an argument about how to interpret Plato in the context of the history of philosophy, but a specific Platonic philosophy of mathematics, Platonic realism about mathematical relations and objects, right? So from Levin's perspective, if you can recompose living tissues into xenobots or anthrobots that reliably discover or create functional forms and aims that have never been selected for by any ancestral lineages, clearly then something more is going on than the uh, playing out of genetic scripts. When a xenobot displays novel capacities, the cost wasn't paid by phylogenetic selection. So as a result, his claim that there must be some ordered latent, uh, what I would call pre-space of possibilities or topos of possibilities, his claim is that this space of possibilities from which such definite patterns can be drawn must be affirmed. This is a very different ontology than the typical physicalism that has guided science up to this point. So it's tempting, in light of all of this, to imagine a realm of timeless patterns that determines the flux of matter um, in physics, but also in biology. And that temptation is hardly a new one. It's the basis, in fact, of the supposedly physicalist concept of a deterministic law of nature. The idea that the messy contingencies of the world are ultimately governed by some kind of hidden, timeless mathematical blueprint. So the challenge here, though, is to articulate the reality of form and thus avoid a kind of nihilistic tailspin into nominalism, but to do so without slipping into a rigid Platonism where perfect immutable originals are impressed upon physical bodies conceived as mere passive imitations, poor copies, or worse, as uh, what Levin calls scratch pads for some kind of disembodied intelligent agency. So let me say where I agree with Levin and where I hesitate a bit. I've been in dialogue with Mike for several years now, and I'm really excited, thrilled even by his research and many of his theoretical moves. I think he's absolutely right to resist genetic reductionism, of course, and to insist that organismic agency is driving morphology and morphogenesis. Um, the mechanistic picture, as classically conceived, traded almost exclusively in efficient causes, that is, pushes from behind, as it were, um, where parts are externally related to other parts. Genes push molecules, molecules push cells, cells push tissues, and somehow at the end of this chain of pushing, you get an organism. Um, but obviously, or I hope, obviously, this story misses something essential. Cells, tissues, organisms exhibit large-scale patterns and homeoresis, really an astonishing degree of error correction and ingenuity in the face of perturbations from the environment and from the stochasticity of molecules within the cell membrane. So um, these are not just mechanical outcomes of some kind of biochemical pinball game. They look much more like the work of agents responding to what Whitehead would call lures or pulls from ahead. And I think Levin's work, his empirical experimental lab work, is showing precisely this, foregrounding this sense of a lure or a pull from ahead. So his xenobots, anthrobots, they're making it vividly clear that you can chop up and recombine living tissues into configurations that evolution, the phylogenetic history of that organism never saw before. And yet, these novel life forms can spontaneously discover coherent morphologies and behaviors. The organism then is not simply pushed into shape by its past, it's reaching toward possible futures, forms that have not yet ingressed in its lineage. So far, so good. I affirm the reintroduction of formal and final causality into biology. But where I begin to hesitate is the way that Levin sometimes describes the relation between patterns and their embodiments. He uses interface in a technical computing sense, terminals, thin clients that are front-ending a distant mainframe, right? And his warning is that if you theorize only the front end, you misdiagnose, misunderstand the system. And, fair enough so far as that analogy goes. But my worry is that there's a slide here from front end to mere puppet, basically. So it's as if agency is living elsewhere and bodies, organisms are but sort of nothing more than disposable terminals. So on this picture, agency belongs to the patterns that exist in some sort of a trans-spatio-temporal morphospace, while bodies, organisms, are the thin user interfaces, scratch pads, as I've heard Levin describe them, upon which those patterns inscribe their designs. So this is a kind of bifurcation that I worry repeats the old split of a kind of two-world Platonism that I really want to overcome. Now, we can question whether uh, two world a two-world ontology is really what Plato is articulating in his dialogues. I'm not going to get into that right now because that's not really Mike's interest. But I want to avoid this kind of dualism between agential forms and mere bodies that are steered around or puppeteered by those forms. This risks assigning all the reality to abstract patterns, all the agency to abstract patterns, and it demotes organismic life to something more or less like an epiphenomenal display. So I want a reformed, what I would call a reformed process-relational Platonism in which, along the lines of Whitehead's philosophy, in which organisms are the present locus of decision, even as they orient themselves uh, in relationship to a structured realm of relevant possibilities or eternal objects in Whitehead's terms. So there is a real living constellation of forms, but its patterns are not puppeteers. They are not the agents. The agency is with the organisms. The decision is made by organisms as to which forms to ingress. So to make forms agents is and thereby render bodies passive is, on my reading, a version of what Whitehead warned against as the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. So process philosophy is an alternative way of orienting towards these forms. It's an alternative proposal that I think avoids the extremes of both reductive materialism, but also transcendent idealism. In Whitehead's terms, forms are potentiae, potentials. They're non-historical, non-spatiotemporal possibilities with patterned relations among themselves, and relations to actuality generally. Now, any particular form is going to exist independently of particular actualities, but from Whitehead's point of view, the realm of forms does not exist independently of actuality generally. Um, Crucially, these possibilities, these eternal objects, do not act. They have no agency. They are not efficient causes in Whitehead's scheme. They ingress. Agency belongs to actual occasions of experience that do the ingression. The events of concrescence, as Whitehead refers to them. That's what an actual occasion is, an event of concrescence, a growing together of past and possible into a novel uh, entity, which contributes itself back to the the process of reality. Um, so in concrescence, the physical past is inherited. It meets the lure of unrealized potential, and moment by moment, occasions of experience are deciding how to integrate the past with the possible. Um, the possible, the realm of forms, are not the agents making the decisions, right? So in every moment of concrescence, an actual entity prehends the world, prehends its world. This is a perspectivalism in the Nietzschean sense. Every actual entity thus feels physically, it feels the relevant features of what has already happened, and it conceptually entertains relevant possibilities that have not yet occurred. And these feelings, these prehensions in Whitehead's technical terms, are not just passive impressions, they're factors in a decision. So the occasion is integrating what has been and what could be into a new act, a new actual entity. And that act then becomes part of the world that another occasion will inherit. And let me actually diagram this briefly, this process of concrescence, so you can get a kind of uh, clearer picture of it. Sorry, just trying to share my screen here. There we go. So I'm using some daffodils to illustrate the process of concrescence, which Whitehead describes as the process by which the many become one and are increased by one. And concrescence is happening at all scales of the universe at all times. He has an event ontology, so the universe is a network of events. It's not a collection of particles in empty space. This is how the process of concrescence works in a schematic sense. There are perished objects in the past environment. These uh, perished objects in the past have to be integrated with eternal objects or pure potentials that are not in the past, they're not in space-time at all. And how this occurs is through a dipolar process. There's a physical pole and a mental pole to every actual occasion. Every concrescence includes both poles. The physical pole is where these perished objects in the past environment are physically prehended. This is what Whitehead calls the objective data of a concrescence. The subjective data is then integrated into a subjective form, which is the subjective response, the affective um, response, the emotional tonality that arises in the occasion as it integrates the past. There's then a subjective aim that's helping to guide the integration of these many prehensions from the past. And in the mental pole, there are these pure potentials, these eternal objects that ingress to help realize that subjective aim. Now, novelty is introduced as a result of the ingression of these pure potentials that were not yet in the physical pole, not yet in the past environment. If there were no ingressions of pure potentials, every concrescence would simply repeat what occurred in the past, repeat what is felt in the physical pole. But in the mental pole, novel potentials are ingressed. Now, every concrescence, every actual occasion, Whitehead says, feels the entire infinite realm of eternal objects. All possibilities are felt, but the vast majority are negatively prehended, which is what this scissor is doing, cutting the strings that the prehensions, conceptual prehensions. This is what Whitehead calls negative prehension. Most of the possibilities are backgrounded and ignored, and each concressing actual occasion is drawing on only those possibilities that are relevant to its own subjective aim. Right, so those possibilities are negatively prehended. At the end of this process of the growing together of the various subjective data in the physical pole, lured by the subjective aim, a satisfaction is achieved. And this is all experiential for Whitehead. He is a pan-experientialist. Uh, Mind goes all the way down in the sense, again, that every concrescence, whether it's associated with an electron or a photon or a dolphin, has a mental pole, has this subjective aim, subjective form, subjective aim, and a satisfaction. And it's this moment of satisfaction where the many become one and are increased by one. A subjective point of view is achieved, but immediately perishes to become what he calls a superject. And this superject then becomes part of the objective data to be inherited by the next round of concrescence. It gains objective immortality in that sense. And so concrescence is an iterative, cumulative process whereby novelty is produced, but continuity with the past is maintained, right? That's a crash course in Whitehead's metaphysics of concrescence. So moving along here, forms or eternal objects in Whitehead's sense become effective only as they are selected and transformed within the creative advance of living occasions, within this process of concrescence as I've just described it. So possibilities require the agential decisions of actualities, of actual occasions to enter into history. This distinction, I think, is really crucial. If we say that the patterns themselves are the agents, then we end up by as a consequence, basically collapsing the polarity between potentiality and actuality. We end up transposing brute fact from the realm of the actual into the realm of the possible, and that cancels this difference um, that maintains a polarity, and it leaves us no room for genuine novelty. Um, Whitehead thinks in terms of polarities, and this polarity between actuality and potentiality is very important for him. It's the dynamo of the creative advance, the dynamo, the engine of evolution, if you want. And to give abstract form agency is to treat forms as actualities, possibilities as actualities. Um, this this is metaphysically problematic um, from my point of view. And this comes through sometimes when, and this isn't just, the way that Mike Levin talks, it's common among some thinkers to refer to mathematical facts. In this Whiteheadian way of thinking, there's no such thing as a mathematical fact. A fact is a contingent historical occurrence. Um, when we talk about mathematical objects, we're talking about forms. We're talking about possibilities. Um, a fact and a form, in Whitehead's sense, they're two different uh, poles of concrete process. Um, Form would be the abstract pole, but we only know abstraction from a concrete point of view, would be one rendering of what Whitehead calls the ontological principle. Um, so, in contrast to collapsing the distinction between actuality and potentiality, if we remember instead that possibilities do not act but are felt and chosen, then we preserve this creative tension that again is driving cosmic evolution from a Whiteheadian point of view. And we can say that organisms live in a value-laden field of potentialities, improvising new configurations that cannot, in their singularity, be predicted in advance. They are not merely implementing code. They are metabolizing information, transforming signals into felt relevance, and writing themselves as they read this information. So, from this angle, I think Levin is right to insist that there must be an ordered latent space of possibilities from which novel morphologies can be drawn. But this realm beyond space-time should not be thought as an abstract heaven of finished designs exerting top-down control. It's more like a structured continuum of adjacent possibilities whose relevance is always indexed to the acts of organisms, to the decisions of living creatures. So forms are not eternal dictators, they're evolutionary companions. They're patterns of definiteness that become determined only after they are taken up by living occasions. They're perishing out of eternality into immortality, a shift from pure potentiality to real potentiality in Whitehead's sense. So this brings us to a distinction, I think, that I think is vital. It's a distinction between cosmology and metaphysics. Um, Cosmology, in this way of framing it, at least, is studying contingent patterns and regularities that hold within our present cosmic epoch, including biological habits of development and morphogenesis, but also physical habits, what are usually called laws and treated as if they are eternal. In Whitehead's view, physical laws are really widespread habits. And so these patterns, these laws, evolve and may change over long stretches of time. Um, Metaphysics, by contrast, seeks the categorical conditions that make such patterns, such cosmological epochs possible in the first place. And when we confuse the two, when we collapse metaphysics into cosmology, I think we end up either elevating contingent forms of organization in physics and biology into transcendent absolutes, or we reduce metaphysical conditions to the contingencies of our current cosmic epoch. Um, Now, Levin does invite us to draw a distinction between physical constraints and what we might call biological capacities. This, for me, immediately raises the question of whether formal causes or organizing patterns and final causes or lures of value, ends, goals, that seem minimally operative in the physical world may become more salient in the biological world, but they're never entirely absent even in the physical. There are phases in the history of the universe, earlier phases of cosmogenesis that often just get quarantined under physics and treated as eternal, bound by eternal law. But there are earlier phases where I think the scene is dominated, um, is not yet dominated by the regularities we call laws. If we rewind, 13.7 billion years ago to the first atoms, this picture of a supposedly um, a physical world supposedly determined by fixed laws, eternal laws. I think things look a bit different. It's, picture the first hydrogen atom that's emerging. A proton and electron are entering into something like a symbiogenetic relationship, to use Lynn Margulis's biological concept. This wasn't the execution of a pre-written script, right? The first hydrogen atom emerges as a creative act. It's the expression of a new capacity for enduring existence. And so what now presents itself to us as a constraint, looking back, we see a periodic table of elements that seems fixed, was once an achievement. So what is given now is really sedimented genesis. So if we follow that sedimentation forward um, across eons, we can see how achievements congeal into the scaffolding that constrains and enables subsequent novelty. So 4.5 billion years ago on this planet, a new kind of organization emerged that inherited these prior accomplishments, these physical constraints, as boundary conditions and as springboards. So on this view, there's no sharp ontological line anymore between non-living and living. There's a continuum of organization where formal and final causation is gradually coming into focus as organisms learn to exploit and recompose the constraints bequeathed by physics and chemistry. So biology on this reading is not merely pushed from behind by efficient causes. The study of organisms, it's not merely the study of organisms pushed from behind by efficient causes. Biology is also the study of organisms, both in their behavior and in their morphogenesis, as pulled from ahead by ideals of form and by valuations. And it's the organisms that are doing the valuing here. Formal and final causes thus re-enter the scientific scene as pattern and as aim. Um, this is a way of thinking about the embryo's morphogenetic sense of limb versus tail, axis, polarity, proportion, and so on. We can't understand these aspects of development without formal and final causality. I completely agree with Levin there, but I think that we need to be more cautious about the metaphysics here. I think we need something like Whitehead's realm of eternal objects. And in Whitehead's account, these eternal objects, this topos of possibility, this continuum of possibility, is ordered by a divine entity. Now, obviously, there's a long history of antagonism between natural science and theology and religion, but it's also true that all of the founding fathers of the scientific program in at least the European modern Western context were motivated theologically. The idea that the human mind could comport itself and come into resonance with the intelligible structure of nature was only credible as a research program to them because of a theological view, more or less a deist view. And we don't need to hold the deist view, but Whitehead argued for a kind of metaphysician's God. It's not a God of religious longing, but of conceptual coherence. So Whitehead's realm of eternal objects and the God that he says envisages and orders this realm of eternal objects or possibilities is not uh, we shouldn't think of some pre-patterned cosmological program that determines actuality. Whitehead's God is not all powerful, not some sort of cosmic engineer. Um, we need a name for the structured uh, pre-space of potentia or the topos of adjacent possibilities that organisms can draw upon um, that prevents the future from collapsing into the past, that holds open a space of potential that's got a value vector to it, right? It's not just randomly arrayed possibilities, it's possibilities that seem to be organized and ordered in such a way so as to serve the intensification of organismic experience and agency. So crucially, in Whitehead's scheme, the eternal is not some to be that this realm of eternal objects is not to be imagined as a kind of frosty stockroom of pre-made potentials or frozen uh, possibilities. In his Harvard lectures, his students record him suggesting that the realm of forms, this realm of eternal objects, alters in its reference to temporal occasions of experience and to the historical process. So he says This is how his students record one of his lectures. I quote, "The light of realization casts the shadow of truth back upon the realm of eternal objects, thus enriching it." So the historic process enriches eternity as each new fact, each novel uh, actual occasion, as it reaches its satisfaction, becomes objectively immortal. And thus, there's a kind of evolving and growing sense of the eternal in Whitehead as um, each concrescence becomes, in a sense, an eternal fact um, to be built on by the next moment of concrescence. So eternity grows in this conception. There was a time when there were no elephants, right? There will be a time when elephants go extinct, but there will never be a time when there were never elephants, right? And so, in this sense, Whitehead is arguing that realization, actualization weaves durable fact values, and I want to put a hyphen in there, fact values, because for Whitehead, every fact is the achievement of some value. Every value has a factual uh, dimension to it. Realization weaves durable fact values into the weft and weave um, of the universe, and that feeds back onto this space, this topos of possibility. So there's a co-creative aspect to this polarity between actuality and possibility for Whitehead. In this dipolar scheme, eternal objects as pure potentials are gathered in the primordial aspect of the divine, what Whitehead calls the primordial nature of God. They're gathered into and unified into a continuum of relevance, so that actual achievements, the realized forms of historical becoming, can then be woven into what he calls the consequent nature of God, preserving as a kind of memory what has been, and also artistically, aesthetically retuning it to the lure of what might yet be. So God, for Whitehead, is an example of concrescence. God is an everlasting concrescence. So unlike all other finite concrescences, God's concrescence is said to be everlasting. It doesn't perish. Everything exists within this divine concrescence. And in this way, for Whitehead, God is not supposed to be an exception to the metaphysical scheme, but it's the first instance of its application, its chief exemplification, in other words, the macroscopic exemplar of concrescence. And so Whitehead's trying to account for a God that is both eternal and historical. He's trying to account for the way in which possibility and actuality are dynamically entangled and require one another, but don't collapse into each other. So Whitehead articulates what has come to be called Mariotopology. Mariology is the study of wholes and parts, and he wants to understand the relations among wholes and parts in the continuum of possibility. Um, Topology is the study of these relations. Topos meaning place, right? It offers, I think, a more concrete approach than what we usually think of as geometry. Topology is non-metrical, so you don't need rulers and coordinates or fixed scales. Um, and so the point here is that aside from a select group of human beings, most organisms don't make decisions using meter sticks. They're not going out measuring the world. Cells, as they engage in embryological development, are not calculating one another's coordinates. I think the engineering mindset that imagines DNA as a set of instructions for computing where each cell needs to be at each moment mistakes an algorithmic blueprint for what is really more like a felt field. So I think a topological lens helps us see this uh, more accurately, more sensitively. So we begin with the whole um, when we're talking about life and organisms, not with the parts. Begin, let's begin as, Mike Levin will often say, we all begin as physics and chemistry, as a fertilized embryo. And then out of the process of development, you get Descartes or any human being. So we begin as one cell. That cell divides. You begin with the whole and then get the parts, in other words. So development is not an accumulation of discrete parts that finally produces an organism. It is a whole that differentiates into parts. The whole precedes the parts. So in merio-topological terms, I think we can see how boundaries are not rigid seams, but dynamic neighborhoods that thicken and thin as the organism negotiates its own becoming. Um, Parts are not molecular parts, say, or they're not little machines that get bolted together. They're regions of a living gradient, and they're transiently stabilized by ongoing relations within the whole. And again, the whole precedes the parts here, right? That's what's crucial. And I think Levin's account and his lab's account of bioelectric fields helps us operationalize this into an empirical research program. This isn't just a speculative idea about wholeness. So if we approach development with an overly mechanistic or engineering mindset, I think we're always going to try to assemble the whole from pre-made components. We're going to be assuming a geometric picture that presumes we can measure everything in advance and assign each piece its coordinate. What I'm calling a topological approach here, speaking loosely, is more organic. It's about feeling one's place in a gradient, just as each cell feels the shape of the bioelectric field around it. And gradients here are evaluative fields. They do not merely constrain, they invite, they goad. And following Whitehead, we can say that the cell prehends its neighborhood. It feels relevant features of the past environment, relevant relative to the field of adjacent possibilities that halo it. And then it decides. Field effects like bioelectric potentials, morphogen gradients, tissue level tensions are not organizational afterthoughts. They're the medium of agency at the scale where the organism's aims become operative. None of this denies the role of molecular interactions, genes, proteins, signaling cascades, and so on, but it places them within an organismic topology. To treat DNA as if it calculated coordinates is to mistake a syntax for semantics and a semantics for a lived pragmatics. The organism is not passively implemented by code. It's actively metabolizing relevant information. So the causal story is not a one-way push for molecules upward. It's a many-leveled resonance in which uh, the whole conserves itself by continually differentiating, where we would expect robust flexibility, error correcting, morphogenesis, graceful accommodation and perturbation to perturbation, um, and local innovations that the whole can then integrate. I think this reframing also touches on physics. It goes beyond biology. We habitually treat space-time as some kind of a metrical container, but geometry, um, at least on Whitehead's view, the geometry of space-time as Einstein had it is we're really talking about a tool for our purposes. It's not the essence of the real. Topology precedes geometry and experience. It's more concrete in that sense. Before we measure, we orient ourselves in place from a perspective. Before we count, we connect. And if the biological world is best understood in terms of these merio-topological neighborhoods and gradients, then I don't think we should be surprised that physical space-time, too, can be approached as a relational topology within which metrical structures are selected by organisms for the problems at hand. There are multiple geometries that can model one and the same physical situation. In other words, none is the be all and end all. There's more than one geometry that could apply to the structure of the physical world. The organism's way of knowing, its way of feeling um, gradients is hinting at a deeper kinship, I think, between the biological and physical orders than measurement alone discloses. So Levin understandably stresses mathematical order, and he talks about information. And here again, I largely agree with his approach, but with one important nuance. I share what I understand to be his resistance to equating the latent ordered space morphospace with information understood as passive data. Um, Information is not information unless it is metabolized, right? So, as Gregory Basin would say, information is a difference that makes a difference. And I would just add, it's a difference that makes a difference to somebody, to some organism. And I think Whitehead's term prehension helps here. Organisms feel or prehend the world in both modes, physically by taking up what has already happened, and conceptually by entertaining relevant possibilities not yet actual. And organisms transmute these feelings, physical and conceptual, into a new fact or a new act. Prehension is like eating data, transforming it into oneself, even as one is transformed in turn by it. So agency isn't something beamed in from above, it's something enacted as decision, a decision in the process of concrescence. Wherever organismic relations reliably co-vary, and here I'm drawing on some of the work of Benita Roy, whenever organismic relations reliably co-vary, information is realized, right? That's how measurement really works and why there's no absolutely external observer. We can't talk about ready-made information independent of the observer to whom that information is relevant. So if by information we mean passive data awaiting a receiver, we've already flattened what makes communication so miraculous. In living organisms, information, again, is observer and situation relative. It's realized only in the act of what my friend Bonita Roy calls the covariance between an agent and its environment. A gradient means climb or descend only for a system that has a meaningful way of coupling with it. So in this sense, information is not something that's stored, right? It's not ready-made. It's enacted. It's produced in the act. It's an interpretive act. The organism brings virtual possibilities into play by co-varying with what matters in its neighborhood. Um, and so if there's a map of development, it's not a static diagram of destinations and coordinates. It's an ongoing, many-leveled resonance of a whole that knows itself only by continuing to become itself. I think Whitehead helps us, his language, his metaphysical scheme helps us keep all these threads together. So each moment in the life history of an organism is a concrescence. There are physical prehensions of what has been, conceptual prehensions of what could be, unified by an evaluative decision that becomes a new fact. The organism's mereotopology is nothing other than the pattern of these decisions accumulated as habit and revisable by novel feeling. Parts are like habits in place. Wholes are habits that hold those parts in place and help them find novel pathways of development. So a formal cause is the pattern that makes sense of the parts, and a final cause would then be the lure that keeps the pattern from collapsing into mere repetition, inviting novelty. So to avoid this bifurcation I mentioned earlier that worries me when agency is applied to forms and organisms are treated as scratch pads or thin interfaces, I think we need a richer, more layered ontology. So my physical body is something like the fruiting body or mushroom that sprouts from a deeper mycelial network. And most of what is causally relevant to the present concrescence of each moment of my experience is ramifying beyond the boundary of my skin temporally, into ancestral achievements, developmental trajectories, cultural inheritances, and spatially, in terms of the microbiomes and ecological networks and the social and technological context that surround me. If we attend only to the mushroom, to the fruiting body, we miss the tangle of mycelium. If we attend only to the mycelium, we miss the mushroom. The right lesson here that I'm taking from this metaphor is that we not exile agency to some abstract heaven of patterns, but embrace a more richly textured ontology as kind of graded layers of organization and efficacy, physical and chemical habits, bioelectric fields, sensory motor schemas, symbolic and aesthetic orders that are all stacked and interpenetrating. In Whitehead's terms, Organisms always exist and make decisions in the thick present. They inherit the past through physical prehension while feeling lures from relevant possibilities. This is conceptual prehension. Formal and final causes, form and aim, they're not aloof puppeteers that are pulling the strings from another dimension. They are the modes of agency that are internal to organic occasions of experience, the ways that a living nexus of occasions is leveraging constraints into capacities. So what looks like law from the outside is, in its origins, a habit acquired by successful acts of integration. What looks like passive material from one scale is at another scale a complex, buzzing society of agents negotiating gradients and values. So, from this perspective, I think Levin's Platonic morphospace can be read as an important cosmological hypothesis about the ordered possibilities that organisms can access and ingress. The process philosophy that I'm adding to the picture here offers that this realm of possibility beyond space-time is not a separate world, but an aspect of this one. It's the conceptual pole of concrescence, access through conceptual prehension. It's not a matter of leaving our embodiment behind, but deepening our embodiment as a result of the ingression of that which is beyond body and beyond space and time. So let me just briefly talk about the structure of this space of possibilities, because this is where I think Whitehead's metaphysics becomes especially helpful. Because of covariance, tugging on one eternal object never brings only that one to the party, so to speak. It arrives with an entourage. Whitehead names these patterned entourages abstractive hierarchies in his book Science and the Modern World, published in 1925 in a chapter titled Abstraction. And the point that he makes here with the way that possibilities come with entourages is easier to see, I think, with the example of color. So red, blue, and green, etc., they don't hover indistinctly as isolated possible shades or hues. They're interdefined within a web of relations that has both an experiential depth and a historical weight behind it. We can think here with Johann Goethe, um, for whom color was not simply what appears when a prism decomposes white light, as Newton had it. This sort of prima facie neatness of Newton's spectrum, I think, from Goethe's point of view, depends on a contrived geometry of apertures and screens and so on, a crucial experiment. Whereas for Goethe, um, exploring the whole range of color phenomena, color becomes an edge phenomenon. It emerges where light and darkness meet and mingle. And so light and dark are thus more primordial in the hierarchy than the chromatic hues that they support and that emerge from their mingling. So yellow and blue then appear as more elemental polarities than, say, green, which is not primitive or primary in the same sense. Green arises out of the mixture of blue and yellow, when blue and yellow mingle. So this is a kind of chromatic genealogy that is an expression of how possibilities hang together among themselves. If I pull on or ingress green into experience, I have, whether I am conscious of it or not, already pulled on blue and yellow in the background. So green co-varies with them. And this is precisely how an abstractive hierarchy works. An example of how it works. The availability of one form presupposes a constellation of correlated forms and contrasts that give it its unique sense. So notice a few things that follow here. First, the continuum of possibility. It's not a free-floating menu of forms that exists entirely independent of actuality. Our visual systems, opponent processes, and the polarities that we discover in practice through media and light and the lived phenomenology of edges and gradients and so on, all of this tunes which colors are salient and how they can be composed. Second, notice the definiteness of possibility cannot be reduced to any single actual occasion either. When green ingresses into a present act of seeing, it does so by drawing upon a relational matrix, light, dark, yellow, blue, that outruns the moment and yet is concretely felt within it. In Whitehead's terms, the eternal objects an occasion conceptually prehends are covariant. They come in patterned constellations. This is how I think, this is how to think a structure of definite possibility that is neither detached from the actual world nor collapsed into it. The world's achievements and our organismic apparatus co-shape the very palette of forms that can be felt, chosen, realized, decided upon. Mathematics offers another analogy here. While its truths feel timeless, its practice shows us that these truths emerge through the creative interplay of discovery and invention. Russell and Whitehead's struggles in the Principia Mathematica illustrate the impossibility of grounding the whole edifice in a final logical foundation. Mathematics evolves through paradox, revision, imaginative leaps. Something similar holds for biological form. Organisms do not unfold according to rigid templates. They dip into a structured but evolving open field of potential, actualizing new patterns through their own activity. Now, Levin understandably stresses mathematical order, but I think aesthetic and ethical forms matter too. Scientific inquiry is lured by the beauty and goodness of truth, for example. So possibility is not just a matter of cold combinatorics, it's graded by a sense of worth. This is very important for understanding the norms which become very apparent in the biological world, if not in the physical, though we could talk about that. Whitehead's primordial valuation, right, his primordial nature of God is simply his account of how an otherwise unstructured infinitude of possibility becomes organized by relevance for finite agents. So let me then begin to wrap up here by offering a kind of reframing of Levin's program, a movement from conceiving of forms as puppeteers to conceiving of them as partners in evolution. I would say that Levin's entirely justified in positing a latent ordered space of form and aim. I think his experiments show that organismic agency cannot be reduced to local molecular interactions or to the ancestral record of natural selection. Cells, tissues, organisms all navigate a field of possibilities that vastly outruns anything encoded in DNA. But instead of saying that patterns in that field are the true agents and that bodies are merely thin clients, I want to say that organisms are the loci of agency and that they orient themselves by a structured continuum of possibilities. Formal and final causes, patterns, and aims are real, but they are internal to organismic decision making. They're not external puppet strings. The thin interface metaphor, if it suggests that agency resides in a disembodied mainframe that's behind the world, behind organisms, this repeats the bifurcation of nature into dead matter and living ideas that we see in the sort of caricature of Plato's two-world theory. A process-relational alternative would say that what Levin is calling forms beyond space-time is it's related to in Whitehead's terms, the conceptual pole of concrescence. It's always and only realized in and through the experience of actual entities, actual occasions. Morphospace is not a separate realm to which we are hooked up, but the way the universe's accumulated achievements and primordial valuations show up as relevant lures for our present decisions. So on this view, again, cosmology is the history of contingent creative events. It's the story of how capacities become constraints, become new capacities, and become new capacities. And then metaphysics seeks the invariant principles that make this cosmological process possible. So categories like process, form, value, relation, actual occasion, eternal object. These invariant principles render cosmic history intelligible without freezing it. Now, if we conflate metaphysics and cosmology, I think we end up being tempted either to reify patterns into abstract agencies that exist above the material world, or we end up reducing agency to an illusion emergent from brute mechanism. I think Levin is correct to resist the latter, and I think process philosophy can help us sidestep the former danger. So to conclude, I think the stakes of all this are not merely conceptual. Um, they're not merely scientific. They shape how we imagine the future of life itself. If we treat the latent space of adjacent possibilities as a predeterminate reservoir of finished designs, then I worry that all novelty becomes a kind of illusion. If we treat forms as unreal, on the other hand, reducible to molecular flux, then the evident creativity of life dissolves into noise, contingently selected um, by the filter of natural selection, which I don't think can get us the novel form um, or the biological agency that many neo-Darwinians assume it can. Process philosophy, I think, helps us avoid both of these extremes by offering us an ontology of what I would call participation. Um, what this looks like is an ever multiplying plurality of actual occasions relating to one another through a unified continuum of potential forms, guided by a cosmic lure that does not compel but invites compositional intensification. On this picture, law is not the iron rule of a transcendent order, but the sediment of repeated successes or achievements. Form is not a rigid template, but a pattern of definiteness available for creative variation. Agency is not an illusion, nor is it a ghostly force beamed in from elsewhere. Agency is the way the universe, at every scale, feels and responds to its own possibilities. Philosophy then becomes less a search for final explanation than a discipline of attunement to this field. There's no arrival, there's no last word. There's only the humility of beginning again in the middle of things, listening for the rhythms of a living universe. I think Levin's Platonic research program in biology is an important chapter in the history of science. It invites us to recognize that the organisms we study are not passive objects, but co-authors of the world, drawing on a structured, value-laden morphospace or topos that is itself evolving as they live, die, and create. So, in short, cosmogenesis does not obey forms, it creates out of them. And I think our task as scientists, as philosophers, as human beings is to learn how to participate more consciously in that creative advance. Um, Thanks for your attention, and I welcome comments, criticisms, and alternative suggestions. Thanks.